Good morning, everyone. My name is Ainsley MacLeod. I'm an Associate Director at the Carbon Trust, and I will be your host for the panel. And Paul, at the top of the event, promised a lively discussion, and I can pretty much guarantee with the guests that we've got lined up, I hope we will be able to deliver on that. So the theme of today and tomorrow is really bringing innovation to industry. But before I introduce the panelists, I just want to take a moment to consider what industry is. It covers many sectors. It's vital to our everyday life. It's our buildings, our cars, our food, the packaging that it comes in. To protect it, it plays an essential role in society and makes a significant contribution to the UK's GDP and provides millions of jobs. However, industry also is a major source of carbon emissions, contributing to about 15% of the UK's total GHGs. It's the third largest contributor after energy production and transport. So it's clear that the rapid decarbonisation of industry is a critical component to help the UK meet its net zero goal by 2050. And as Mark mentioned, according to the UK's industrial decarbonisation strategy, to keep industry on track to meet that net zero goal, we're looking at emissions needing to fall by at least 2/3 by 2035, and that's not very far away. So over the next hour, we'll be focusing on the net zero challenge and how we can create collectively the right environment to incentivise the right action that's needed at the pace and scale we need to ensure that industry can effectively contribute to the net zero transition. Unless energy use can be reduced, businesses will face increased costs. They will not get the protection against volatile energy markets, and also, productivity can be impacted. So bringing down energy demand is really important, and it also has a benefit across the cost of the system while improving competitiveness in the UK. So before I move into the actual panel, I'm going to bring up our 5 speakers. So we have Lindsay Smart, Head of Sustainability at Triple Point. We have Jo Harrison, who's the Director of Environment, Planning and Innovation at United Utilities. We have Wouter van Tol, Head of Government, Community Affairs and Sustainability at DS Smith. We have Professor Sam Turner, who's the Chief Technology Officer at the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, and of course, Dr. Mark Taylor, who you've just heard from. So welcome, everyone. Very good to have you with us. So I'm just going to sort of hand over and do a quick round the panel kind of introduction. So start with Lindsay. Maybe sort of just tell everyone who you are.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Ainsley. So my name's Lindsay Smart. I head up sustainability for Triple Point. We are an investment manager. We've got around 2 billion AUM, just over. And we make investments to deliver profits that have a purpose. So we invest in non-listed assets, and we have 5 key investment areas: social housing, digital infrastructure, lending and leasing, ventures, and energy efficiency. We also are the UK government's partner in delivering their loan and grant scheme for their heat network investment programme. So there are a couple of activities there that we have that kind of directly align to this conversation, but really as a matter of course now as well, we are thinking about carbon exposure in all of our investments, not just those where there is that direct alignment. So looking forward to the conversation today. I'll hand back to you, Ainsley.
Thanks, Lindsay. And Jo, maybe you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So I'm Jo Harrison. I'm Director of Environment Planning and Innovation at United Utilities. For those of you who don't know, United Utilities is the water company that serves the northwest of England. So we serve about 7 million people with water and wastewater services. So my job is really to look at that sort of longer term environmental planning and making sure that we can sort of really balance both the requirements of the water environment, so really driving improvements in water environment, but also achieving really ambitious targets with regard to carbon and obviously resilience for climate change. So United Utilities and all the water companies in England have signed up to a net zero target by 2030, which is really, really ambitious. And we're well on the way to starting to deliver that.
Great, thanks, Jo. And Wouter.
Yeah, thank you, Ainsley. So, hello, everyone. My name is Wouter van Tol. I'm the Head of Government, Community Affairs and Sustainability for DS Smith. So, DS Smith is a FTSE 100 packaging company. We make paper packaging. If you've been to a supermarket recently, or if you've ordered something online, then you've probably been in touch with, literally, with our packaging. So, we are the biggest recycler of paper in Europe. So, we have three stages. We pick up the paper, recycle it, turn it into new paper, turn that into packaging, and at the end of life of the packaging, we pick it up again, and so the circle continues. And we call that the 14-day box-to-box model. Our purpose is redefining packaging for a changing world, and so we're working very hard in a couple of areas. One is circular economy. We're the strategic partner of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and circular economy is absolutely central to our strategy. And the second part is climate action. So we've committed to a science-based target and net zero, and I think the combination of climate action and circular economy is what we're really focused on.
Thanks, Wouter. And Sam, over to you.
Thanks, Ainsley. So I'm Sam Turner. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. We're part of the wider Catapult network, and we focus on taking early stage technologies, maturing those to commercial value across the manufacturing sector. We've actually got 7 centres in our network, 18 sites. So centres each focusing a special manufacturing technology or sector area. We've got nearly 4,000 people across the network, so we're quite a size and partly funded by governments. Our mission really is to drive a thriving competitive manufacturing sector in the UK. So understandably, looking at reduction of industrial emissions is a really important part of our brief at the moment. And Ainsley said at the outset that around 15% of emissions, territorial emissions, relate to manufacturing content or industrial content. We work across all sectors, but when we look at consumption emissions, so embodied emissions in the manufactured goods and services that we consume in the UK, manufacturing content is actually a lot higher. And a recent piece of work we did across the Catapult network, working with Energy Systems, Catapults and others, suggested it could be as high as 40% of our total emissions are embodied in manufactured goods and services wherever they're produced in the world. So we're thinking about how do we reduce those kind of consumption emissions, the embodied emissions in manufactured goods, and do that in such a way that actually we can not only reduce our emissions footprint, but actually increase our manufacturing content for the UK. So we'd like to explore really some of the ways we can do that with the right standards and innovation and investment in place.
Great, thanks, Sam. And Mark, and I'm conscious you've just done your presentation, so I'm not sure you need to introduce yourself again, but is there anything you want to say before we kick off into the main discussion?
I'm looking forward to the discussion. I mean, the other thing I would add is, obviously you've just heard my talk, so you all know what I'm about, but the other thing we do in Size is we are co-investors in the Clean Growth Fund. So it's a venture capital fund, and that is innovating in young SMEs. And indeed, recently it made an investment in a energy efficiency program company called Carbon Re. So hopefully you can see that we are, much like Lindsay, trying to make sure we're investing in the right type of companies to help us deliver net zero.
Great, thanks, Mark. And I think that's a really strong signal of active participation of government in commercialising companies. So over the next, I think we've got about 40 minutes to cover off quite a lot of questions. And I think I really want to kick off with a bit of a sort of round the panel sort of opening, because obviously we've got a really good mix of finance, innovation, industry, and obviously government. And it's clear that collaborative innovation has a massive role in terms of de-risking the next wave of technologies that are going to help us get to where we need to get to. And I just wondered if we could reflect on, what is the role of each component of that system, and where do we need to focus our efforts in order to ensure that we are reaching that sort of tipping point of action. And I just wondered if we could maybe start with Joe, United Utilities perspective on where you see your role within that broader ecosystem.
Thank you for that. So as I sort of said before, we've and the rest of the water industry set really ambitious targets for 2030. I think one of the comments that was made earlier was around the fact that, we are all sort of dealing with a very emerging science. And so in the water industry in particular, a lot of our carbon footprint is, we have a significant amount driven by our energy consumption, but actually the large part is driven by directly what we do. We manage people's wastewater, and that naturally degrades and it releases methane and NOx and carbon dioxide. And so one of the things that we're really finding is that the science around that whole process is really new and constantly emerging and constantly developing. So, I think sort of areas where we can really collaborate and where we can sort of drive improvements is around that real understanding of actually what our carbon footprint is, and then how we sort of can work with that ecosystem of suppliers to really understand how we can drive that change. So we're one of the first companies, water companies, to set a science-based target for our Scope 3 emissions as well. So we're having some really interesting conversations with our supply chain, and finding a real split really in terms of those organisations that are also setting their own carbon targets and they're very proactive, and those that really haven't thought about it at all. So I suppose, I think it takes everybody, doesn't it? It takes every aspect of the supply chain to really start having those conversations, really active conversations, really purposeful, and are really focused on trying to achieve targets to try and drive things forward.
Great, thanks. And Sam, just thinking about where you're sitting, obviously Joe's talked about the role of science, sort of research development, and obviously a lot of the work you're doing is trying to bring a lot of that research and sort of academic thinking into the fore. And I mean, do you have any views in terms of where the sort of main challenges are, or any of the barriers that exist within pulling that sort of science and research into that commercial environment?
Yeah, thanks, Ainsley. I think one of them actually is around the standards. So it's great to hear, Joe, you're on the journey with Scope 3 emissions, and I'm not surprised to hear some of the challenges you've got in terms of the different maturity of your suppliers there, because we do see a bit of confusion around standards for Scope 3 and for upstream embodied emissions in particular. So I think greater clarity and uniform reporting is really important. Might sound like innovation, but as an engineer, actually, we've looked at all the tech we've got to apply, but that I think is the starting point, because a clear way of reporting, embodied emissions means you then start to contract and procure against, against emissions, and that's incentivizing manufacturers at every stage in the value chain then to start reducing emissions footprint, because they're going to win business on it. So I think almost making the market pull through the way that we report emissions and clarity on the embodied emission standards is really important. I think beyond that, some of the work we've done has shown that a bulk of the embodied emissions actually lies in the early stage materials extraction, materials processing. So the circular economy is clearly a big part of the answer. I think it's not something other; it's a big part of the answer for reducing industrial emissions footprint. So looking at some of the technologies that enable value retention for materials through life, traceability, looking at segregation of materials end of life. That's a really important place to look, I think, and creating the economy, the market that pulls through solutions. And then, of course, around resource efficiency. There's a lot of technology we've been working on for years in the manufacturing space, looking at optimizing productivity and cost and lead time. And many of those solutions around automation, digital tools, we can also turn to optimizing for resource efficiency, which may give short-term cost benefits, but of course start to lead to energy and material consumption reduction in factory. So I think the standards piece, looking at circular economy, value retention, and then looking at in-factory resource efficiency, I think are where a lot of the innovation technologies need to go. So some interesting digital tools coming through that can underpin all of those things as well.
Great, thanks, Sam. And just picking up on your experience, Wouter, at DS Smith, is anything to add, or are these challenges that you share?
Yeah, I really like that we're talking about Scope 3 emissions, so important. I also like that we're talking about circular economy, because it's part of the solution, and energy efficiency as well. But the point I'd like to make is, when we talk about this transition, people sometimes think about it in black and white and think about that there's one thing that we need to do, but actually what we need to do changes over time. So it is a roadmap. And my point here is that we need different technologies at different times. If we wait for the silver bullet, if we wait for, I don't know, hydrogen or something to save the day, then we already will miss our science-based target for 2030, because hydrogen will not be available in sufficient scale and at the right cost to be the solution for 2030. So I would like to see us coordinate regulations, coordinate support and investments to prevent stranded assets and help us to reach our science-based targets for most companies will be 2030, but also net zero by 2050. So see it as a roadmap from now until 2050 with different investments and different technologies required at different points in time. If we can coordinate that between the different actors, then I think we have a chance of cracking this without doing damage to the economy, without stranded assets.
Thanks. So, I mean, looking at that sort of continual evolution whilst we're on the journey to reaching that 2050 goal, Mark, how do you feel that UK government or government in general can actually ensure that, you know, regulation and policy making is sort of tracking that sort of evolution and creating that environment that enables that change to happen within industry?
I'm very reassured by the quality of the conversation we've had so far. I think this is a big challenge for government, and it is reliant on us having good relationships with industry and developing understanding of detailed scientific and engineering understanding of what these processes involve. And that indeed is actually a key part of our program. So although on the face of it, we're doing innovation in this and innovation in that, actually a key part of what we're doing is taking the intelligence we learn from that and informing policy. I can see us starting to do that. For example, Wouter mentioned hydrogen, which unfortunately many people do see as a silver bullet. I think it's a bullet that we can put in our gun, but you know, it's not a silver one. It's just another one of the bullets that we need. So it certainly is important. But you noticed when we came up with it with the hydrogen strategies in the summer, alongside it, there was a consultation on standards for low carbon hydrogen. So this was very important. You all will have seen the report earlier in the year from, I think it was Harvard, who pointed out how poorly executed carbon capture and storage can really be actually detrimental for the environment, particularly if you've got uncontrolled methane leakage upstream. And that really brings forward how government, as well as supporting the technology, needs to make sure that it's developing the knowledge to be able to write good regulation and good standards. And I know that our colleagues in DEFRA are trying to start the journey around resource efficiency. So I feel like government is starting to recognize it, and certainly compared to 3-4 years ago, I'd say it's transformed. But I think it's really important that industry works in partnership with government, so we make sure that we make informed policy decisions, because that's the thing I'm most nervous about, is that government makes misguided regulation. I'm before my time as a civil servant, I used to work in cars. I worked on turbo diesels, and I remember working in turbo diesels over at BMW, making fantastic products, but everybody knew that diesels in a car was a really bad idea for air quality. We knew about the particulates, and we knew about the NOx emissions, and yet government was saying low tax regime for diesels because of the low carbon footprint. So it's really important that government learns from those mistakes. I believe we have, but the way to do it is to make sure we have an honest and full dialogue with the full range of industry to make sure we develop informed policy and regulation.
Great, thanks, Mark. Any views on that in terms of sort of how it's going? You know, do you feel it's working? And
well, I'll reply to that. I really support what Marcus just said. How important it is that we talk to each other, that we coordinate, and that we have informed policy decisions. And diesel is a great example of that. If we chase one indicator like CO2, then you could make really, really bad policy decisions or really bad business decisions. And so it's important that you look at more than just the one, so you prevent unintended negative consequences. So I really applaud that. I also applaud that we don't just chase whiz-bang, high-risk innovation, which can look very attractive, but it is very simple things like biogas, for example. Biomethane could be a really good solution for some of our sites, but we see that biogas is not always available in sufficient quantity, and we'd really like to see it's an existing technology which could be a very good replacement for natural gas. But we'd like support for that so we can increase the availability of it. Biomass is another one, which is a transitional technology. Everybody knows it's not perfect, but until the hydrogens, etc., come around, I think it deserves support as a temporary solution.
Can I just come in as well there? Sorry. So I think, Mark, one of the things that you sort of reflected on was that tie-up between BEIS and DEFRA. And I think that's something that the water industry in particular would really, really welcome, because one of the things that we sort of experience quite often is a sort of drive to improve other aspects of the environment, such as water quality, potentially at the expense of our carbon footprint. And so really having a sort of joined up approach across government, balancing the overall environmental improvements that we want to see and making sure that the sort of the drive to achieve one thing doesn't impact our carbon footprint or indeed a different aspect. So yeah, we would really welcome a real focus on that join up.
I certainly welcome that, Joe, and we've been trying to build bridges with DEFRA. Just to come back to Wouter's point, we do indeed recognise the issue with biomass, and BEIS will be coming out with a biomass strategy next year. But in our own programme, we have a large biomass feedstocks programme, which is in recognition of what you said. There is a lack of biomass resource in the UK. Again, we don't really see the solution as of importing biomass. We actually import a huge amount of biomass for electricity generation at the moment. So we're seeking to move away from that. And in recognition of that, we're actually, our innovation program, which I'm so used to dealing with industry, we're now dealing with farmers and talking about hemp and indeed seaweed to try and boost our stock. So I think you're absolutely correct. We need to look across a full range of solutions. And that indeed is why NZIP is such a broad ranging program, because there are no silver bullets. There are a collection of bullets that will get us there.
Great, thanks. And Lindsay, obviously you've been working in that sort of ESG sort of field for the last sort of 15 years. And I just wondered, obviously the investor plays a really important role in terms of unlocking some of this activity. And, we're all on a bit of a constant journey of innovation and discovery and learning and feedback loops of knowledge. How does the investor track all this? And how do you know what is a good investment?
Yes, it's a challenge, and it's one that I guess you kind of meet it in different ways. So for all of our investments now, carbon is something we have to take into account. It's a risk to our investments, and so we need to carefully consider what is our exposure to carbon through this investment. What can we potentially do about that? Is that a case of we may choose not to make the investment on the basis of understanding the potential risks that we face? Or it may be that we can engage with the asset through ownership, so that we can look to improve behaviours, look to reduce the exposure over time, or the kind of the way that the company's behaving, which means we can have an impact on reducing carbon exposure. The other thing that's really challenging for us is data and information. So the conversation around Scope 3, that's a really big challenge for investors. We want to understand that as well, but getting information is difficult. And so often we're trying to start those conversations. We're trying to kind of use our role, use our position of influence to explain that this is increasingly important. It's important so we can understand it for our own investment risk. It's important because we're also under pressure. So investors now are under pressure through a whole range of disclosure requirements for us to know our own scope 1, 2, and 3, and to be able to disclose that. So those conversations with the managers of assets that we're investing in are increasingly, they range in terms of the quality of those conversations. Some of the when we're investing in some assets, people really understand that that's important to us and want to work with us to improve the data provision. Others, it's more of a struggle. So anything that can help in that chain of assets and the businesses understanding that information and data capture on around carbon and efficiencies is hugely important for investors to speed up the investment process. We can invest faster if we have greater levels of information, and we can have greater confidence in the quality of the asset that we're buying. And I would also say that the bigger picture that feeds in for us, just coming back to the previous point as well, is around that kind of quality of kind of consistent and long-term policies also really helps our investing, because we have confidence in the direction of travel around the types of innovation that are going to be supported, the types of technology that's going to be supported, and also again standards. So quality of the standards that are expected from businesses operating in a carbon intensive environment. Where those standards are of a higher level, then again we can move faster because we have greater confidence in the kind of the base level of behaviors that a business has to attain before they can even operate in the marketplace at all. So that also really helps speed up investment too. So it's kind of a combination of our requirement to dive into this in more detail, to understand it, to analyze it in greater detail, the ability for us to acquire data to improve the quality of our analysis, and then just the surrounding environment in which standards and policies are high quality, that give us a level of reassurance in terms of those basic levels of behaviors that we're going to come across.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. I think on the topic of standards, we touched on that previously, and I wondered if anyone had any views on the sort of, can standards and the sort of need to evolve these standards keep up with the pace of innovation and sort of decarbonisation that is required? Obviously there's lots of standards across different industrial sectors, depending on where you are sitting within that world. And I just wondered if there was any comments on the pace of the evolution in standards, and whether that's happening quick enough.
Yeah, I'll come in there, Ainsley. I think traditional standards development is too slow for the challenges we face right now. We've been talking about Scope 3 measurements, and actually I think even the standards we have in place now aren't yet quite fit for purpose. There's greater clarity required. An interesting kind of observation on how can we move quicker. As HVM Catapult, we worked on we led the ventilator challenge, called what rolled back the clock for sort of 15 months, and that was a sort of a sense of national kind of urgency, where a number of firms, mostly from the automotive and aerospace sectors, came together to build 15,000 ventilators for the government. And an interesting learning from that was the ability to work with regulators. So this was companies who didn't have were sort of iterating new designs of ventilators, working regulators to make aerospace companies working to medical standards. So that was, some of that wasn't standards development, but it was working very closely with regulators, hand in hand, to address the challenge. And that things were delivered in a few months. It would normally take a couple of years. So there's examples of how you can work industry, government, and regulators together hand in hand to create and roll out standards. And I think there's got to be some work on piloting some of those, looking at what's good practice, probably consortia of large corporates from different sectors coming together to agree how those standards need to be developed and delivered. So be it for embodied emissions, or for be it around carbon capture and storage, or hydrogen usage. I think it's there are examples of how we can move much quicker, but working in collaboration and partnership, and challenging some of the standards bodies and agencies who I know are looking at this around how can we develop pilots that can be tested over a matter of months rather than years, and then formalised and rolled out on the back of that. So yeah, there are good examples of where that has been done, and there's an appetite to do it, but it's very much about collaboration, piloting, testing, and demonstrating, I think. And also looking at one of the audience questions, actually, on a related subject from Maddie around the big corporates having to dip into their pockets to deliver some of the savings. And I think it's a related point again. If we can develop standards that enable the big corporates, government to procure really clearly against emissions and embodied emissions, then there's an incentive for the 90%, a market pull to start reducing carbon footprint and reporting against that reduced carbon footprint and looking at their own supply chains. So I think that there needs to be that market pull, and standards are, I think, a big part of the answer that will start to drive the wholesale transformation and decarbonisation of our industrial footprint.
Thanks, Sam. Anyone else want to come in on that in terms of standards and incentivising the right behaviours and market pool?
So I would definitely agree with Sam about collaboration. So we had to do quite a bit of standards development on the Hy4Heat program, both on the purification standards of hydrogen and on the safety assessment. In the end, we had 40 companies collaborating. I think we went far too slow, but lots of people have been patting me on the back saying we did a great job. I think that is a big challenge for government and regulators to be able to up the pace on this and get the urgency on this. And I think one of the things that I'm hoping will come out of COP26 is that people will realize the urgency. I have to admit, working on climate change within government, sometimes I get very frustrated how a vaccine can be done in 6 months, which is fantastic and has saved tens of thousands of lives, or even indeed hundreds of thousands of lives. I see the climate emergency as in the same place. And I think one of the things we can do is, if we have industry and indeed the public, trying to convince politicians that this is just as urgent, I would argue much more urgent than COVID, and we really need to up the pace, and then that would really help, rather than just having a few civil servants, come on guys, we need to move faster. Unfortunately, we're not the most dynamic. Of course, we can be the most dynamic people, but we're not always the most dynamic people, and we tend to want to follow processes carefully, which is important. But for me, it was interesting in hydrogen, which can be a very dangerous gas, like any explosive hydrocarbon. Obviously, there's no carbon in that, but explosive gas. We were able to move at a decent speed, and when we discovered issues, we don't understand this, we set off a separate program, did the experiment, got it done, got the information, and got moving quickly. And that kind of pace we need to bring in. I think it's really important what Lindsay said in setting up the Clean Growth Fund. We spent an inordinate amount of time defining the standards by which we would judge the companies we invest in. It's massively challenging, and even with government resources, it was still a big challenge to get that defined. I think we managed it, and the Clean Growth Fund is making very good quality investments, but I totally sympathize with you. That's really difficult to do, and it needs to evolve, which is the big challenge. So certainly I would appreciate if industry and indeed the public can help support government to move faster. That'd be fantastic.
Great.
Well, I would certainly support that. We have a range of really big investments that we'd like to make, but we probably need some help, and we need to have agile sort of ways of working around that, because these projects are so big and they take so much time to set up that if you miss a year, then you're already, well behind against your 2030 targets. So if we can do it, I fully agree with what Mark is saying. If we can do it for COVID, surely we can, do a similar way of agile decision making for climate as well.
Thank you. And I think, there's a very strong message of collaboration coming out. And I think, just bringing it back to the sort of BEIS Industrial Energy Efficiency Accelerator, for example, where we are working with public and private sort of investment and funding to de-risk some of the technologies that are actually going to help drive some of these deep decarbonizations in hard to reach processes. Any comments on how you see that being ratcheted up? How could we do even more in order to really move beyond that business as usual horizon? Do we need more government funding? Do we need more collaborative programs? What's the sense across the panel?
I mean, from our perspective as an investor, where our involvement with the government's heat network investment program was as a result of us wanting to see progress in the sort of the low carbon heat market, but recognizing that it wasn't at a state where it was really investable for us. And the only way that we could kind of participate was to act as a provider of services for the deployment of the government's program. And so for us, that was sort of like a really long-term play, in that if we could participate in that program, help the government in the deployment of it, hopefully the longer term success of that program will be it becomes an investable marketplace, and then we'll be very well positioned to enter into that marketplace. So I think sometimes as well, it's about having to, unfortunately, have a bit of a long-term view. We need to move quickly, we need to move things, fast, but at the same time, sometimes it's about recognizing that, yeah, there is going to be the need for government support, which means it won't immediately, certainly from our perspective as investors, be a space we can get into for some of our strategies, depending on the structure and the nature of the strategies. Through our ventures, we look for innovation and for kind of those smaller enterprises that we can back from the ground up. But for these kind of bigger projects and bigger shifts in technology, like a shift to heat networks, we can't do that on our own. That that does require that kind of longer term play, and for us, that's how we saw we could participate, is that we can at least contribute our skill set to the deployment of the grants and loans, and then be ready at the point that hopefully it becomes an investable marketplace, which is partly why we've set up our energy efficiency fund, is that fund can invest in heat networks.
Thanks, Lindsay. And Joe, is there anything you want to bring in from a United Utilities perspective, just in terms of that sort of investment horizon on innovation?
Yeah, I suppose sort of the critical thing for sort of water companies is, as a regulated industry, we are sort of operating within lots of different sort of frameworks with different regulators. So obviously we work very closely with Ofwat, but also the Environment Agency and DEFRA and Natural England and so on. And I think what would be really, really helpful for us is that if we had a consistent way of valuing carbon and climate change adaptation as well into those decision making and regulatory processes. And that would really help us, because at the moment we've got different views from different regulators and different priorities, which just sort of creates a level of confusion really for us. So having a really structured approach with a clear way of valuing carbon would help no end.
Can I just come in on the back of that comment as well, because that's something that as well for in our world of investment, that is a huge challenge too. So for example, right now we have the EU taxonomy, which isn't fully finalized. Elements of it's still in draft form. So there are certain technologies that we don't yet know whether they will fall inside the scope of being aligned to energy transition or outside, which obviously that makes it very difficult for us to then feel confident or not to back those technologies. So that sort of call for clearer guidance, clearer standards again, and disclosure requirements is hugely important from an investor perspective, because until we have that, it does slow down our investment process. And obviously we know now that the UK government has its green finance roadmap, and which will follow a lot of the EU taxonomy and the SFDR guidance. So again, I guess it's kind of a call for that to come out as quickly as possible, for it to be aligned as possible, and for there to be as much clarity as quickly as possible, because again, that will otherwise act as a barrier to investment. I think on the whole, it's a very good thing that we have these disclosures and improvement in comparability across the investment world, but we kind of need the clarity of the content of the disclosure to come faster. Otherwise, investment is kind of held back until we have that clarity to a certain extent.
Ainsley, on the subject of the role of government and investment, I think clearly there's a role to play that government does play always traditionally in sort of de-risking and looking at the technologies that need to be developed further. Some of them, there are things that are relatively mature that can be deployed, so to help on the deployment side, but developing some of those solutions, be it hydrogen, carbon capture storage, circular economy related solutions, new materials, etc. I think developing them so they're available to industry, but also understanding within each of those where might UK play a leading role globally as well. So we're actually not only delivering our UK targets, but also creating exportable solutions. So if we can identify within that end-to-end hydrogen value chain, for example, where we think the best solutions will be and where the UK can play, and then targeting funding in those spaces, for around CR&D funding, research and development funding, collaborative research and development funding to accelerate those development of those solutions, maybe clusters of developers, I think is really important. And also then when we get to large-scale deployment, there are some things where perhaps the market incentive isn't there yet. We talk about circular economy and the infrastructure required to process secondary materials, whether that be steel or other sectors. And if I was just talking about the work clearly that you're doing in the packaging sector, in some cases there may be support needed to put that infrastructure in place. So it's a government, industry, and the investment community coming together to put the infrastructure in place that will deliver the national targets in terms of the primary materials processing, which is capital intensive equipment that's going to need to be invested in. And that will not only get our overall footprint down, it will eat into our kind of global consumption footprint as well. If we actually have a greener infrastructure in the UK that's taking a bigger share of our manufacturing content and taking greater ownership of our manufacturing footprint.
Great, thanks, Sam. And Mark, do you want to come in there? Any views on role of government for that investment in the enabling infrastructure?
Well, I think we need to be careful. I mean, the general tone, which I'm very sympathetic to and agree with, is that government needs to do more. So needs to do more in standards, needs to do more, support more investment. All I can say is, we've asked the Chancellor for more money, a lot more money. We've not been successful because obviously we're recovering from COVID and a lot of other challenges to be met. So that's a big challenge. I think on some of these things, I do think that potentially industry or other third parties can start to work together to develop standards. So my own fund, I'm supporting development standards, green finance standards. So in investment, we've been working with BSI and continue to do so. But actually, the engagement of industry is much more important, and a lot of the knowledge is in industry. So I do think we need to be careful not to go, oh, government needs to do this, government needs to do that. Government will not, much as it might like to, will not be able to do everything. I'm very conscious, as Sam briefly touched on, hydrogen and CCS. The government has taken on a massive challenge in delivering 2 industrial clusters, low carbon by 2030. So it needs to deploy 2 large-scale carbon capture infrastructure networks on the east and west coast. That's a huge challenge, and needs to develop business models for hydrogen so that people can actually buy and use hydrogen and remain competitive in industry. And at the same time, needs to come up with policies with regard to the carbon content or net zero compatibility of products so that we, again, can tackle carbon leakage. So there's a huge amount of work to be done. But I would appeal for government to get help. And I think entities like the Catapults, which I know you do a fantastic job, Sam, working with industry can help us with initiatives, develop thinking and insight, and try and accelerate this process. But I think if we sit back and go, oh, government's got to do this, government's got to do that, it's very difficult for us to be able to do all that in the time frame and build a CCS infrastructure and build a hydrogen grid and enable industry to be able to use the carbon capture network and the hydrogen network, and keep the economy going, and deal with COVID. The list gets on. So we need to be realistic about what government can do on its own. So I think it's very important that industry collaborates with themselves and with government. And indeed, it does, to me, bring back to the IEA scheme. The great thing about the IEA scheme, where we've had both paper companies and water companies involved, it's really helped inform us what the challenges are and what the issues are when you might go, like Joe mentioned, you might go and chase carbon. We need to get carbon down, or chase ammonia, or whatever it might be, that there are other impacts on, say, electricity consumption that all needs to be managed very carefully. And that is really useful intelligence for us in developing standards and regulations.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think that's a really useful point, and I think the complexion of COVID and what that's brought over the past sort of year and a half, nearly 2 years, and just having been relatively close to a lot of the innovation projects that are being delivered through the BEIS IEA, it has been very much a collaborative effort, and learning and feeding back the learnings in order to, get the results that we've delivered out of the first phase. And I think, when I was at COP, there was definitely a big call for, governments across the world to create that certainty, to establish that regulation and policy that will enable decision making to be done in an effective way. And there's also a lot of excitement around hydrogen, CCUS, the broader electrification discussion. But I just wondered if there was any views on, how do we ensure that we also balance this with sufficient focus on things like energy efficiency, which is not really a headline grabbing solution. It's kind of, it is I know it has always been, in my experience, in my sort of 20 years in climate change, the sort of poor cousin to anything that's a little bit shinier and bigger and seems to be a bit flashier and a bit more of a silver bullet from some audiences. So I just wondered if anyone's got any views on how do we keep the focus on actually delivering some of that basic immediate impact that energy efficiency can deliver.
Well, I think I love a bit of energy efficiency because it reduces waste. This is circular economy in practice. If you can just reduce the waste, take it out, it's good for business. It's good for the environment. So this is stuff that we do day in, day out in every site, and it is a staple of what we do. It happens anyway. That is obviously mostly to do with our core processes of paper making, for example, but also things like just replacing lighting with LED lighting and all kinds of simple stuff that you can do. I think we know how far we can get with that. We know what the energy efficiency is we can get every year, but we will not hit our science-based target or net zero if we continue on that path. And I come back to what I said at the beginning, which is that you need to look at in time, which technologies do you need at which time to hit those targets. Energy efficiency absolutely is a building block of that. But also, we won't get there if you want to decarbonize heat, which is very important for our industry. If you want to decarbonize heat, and you want to hit your science-based target, you need to look at the technologies that are available now that can deliver that. Because if you buy a new boiler, that will have a life of about 15 years. So this comes back to the investment horizon, and you need to plan for that. So that's where biogas and biomass are very important. But at the end of that boiler's life, you have another choice. What do you do then? And by that time, perhaps electrification, if the grid is strengthened sufficiently. Electrification, hydrogen, and other technologies are available. So I really think it's important that when we collaborate with government and between businesses, that we really look at the roadmap in chunks of time and look at the investment horizons and don't just focus regulation and innovation at what is right in front of us, but also not too far, but look at it in these time chunks. Which technologies are available when? What are the investment horizons we need to deal with? And so what needs to be in place to, for example, temporarily support the zero carbon element, zero carbon rating of biomass, knowing that it's only a temporary transitional solution, but that it's important in that role.
I think that's a very good point. I had a very interesting experience on our program called Modern Energy Partners, which is looking at decarbonizing public sector sites. This is unrelated to industry, but exactly like you talked about, Wouter, we turned up at the sites and everybody's, oh, right, BEIS is going to buy us a heat pump. Oh, BEIS is going to switch us to hydrogen. And actually, what BEIS did is we turned up and so at a prison complex down in the Isle of Sheppey. Most of what we did is we put in LED light bulbs and we got the BMS working. We got the building management system working, and we had a significant impact. Another example is Gould Hospital, who were very excited about, oh, you got to do a heat pump. You got to do a heat pump. Actually, a heat pump in the current state of the infrastructure of the house of the hospital would have just shot their bills up. What we ended up doing is we got rid of a coal boiler, swapped it for a gas boiler. It has a life of 10 years. And we've insulated the hospital and put in LED light bulbs. And that has had a massive impact, was the best quality investment at the time. And then you'd be reassured to know, Lindsay, the longer term plan is in 2030, there'll be a heat network developed, which they can join. So longer term, they'll switch to a heat network. And that was developing a long-term strategy. And in year one, it was the boring stuff like the light bulbs and the insulation. And with our Industry of the Future program, we're trying to do that with industry. So we're trying to make sure, I'm not sure everybody's as efficient as DS Smith, which sounds really impressive, but we make sure we set out a strategy that ends up in net zero in an economic way, and don't go and chase the fancy toy. Otherwise, we'd have ended up with prisons with a heat pump at least twice as big as it needed to be. And the key thing about energy efficiency and how I think we can make sure that people focus on it is it saves money. It saves money. It pays back very quickly. And it also saves money in the larger scale transformative infrastructure investments. So in the hydrogen or the heat pump, because you can get a smaller heat pump or buy less hydrogen, whatever it may be.
Great, thanks. It's very encouraging to hear a rallying cry for energy efficiency. And we've got maybe sort of 3 minutes left. So I just wondered if we just go round each panelist, if you've got one message that you want to give to this audience. We've got really good attendance from across a number of different sectors, academia, and innovation companies. And I just wondered if you've got one bit of advice, a golden nugget of advice, what would it be? Jo, let's start with you.
Oh, I was really hoping you weren't going to start with me then. I think, the water industry, it makes lots of decisions in the long term, and trying to really raise the sort of the profile of carbon and making it something that is important for now is hard when you're facing the impacts of weather and so on, like we've seen over the weekend. So I suppose for me, the critical thing is, it's really driving that the sort of the narrative that saving carbon saves money and makes us more efficient. And so it's unfortunately that it's a hard message, but one that I think is the only one that will really drive change in the short term.
Great, thanks. Very good. Lindsay.
So I think for me, coming at it very much from kind of like the investor perspective, that energy efficiency is really important. As Mark said, it's not just about the kind of the shiny bullets. Thinking about energy efficiency and the role of that in the transition. And from my perspective, really importantly, is think about how you are going to be able to demonstrate that your efficiencies are effective, that you are actually saving the carbon that you think you are, or that you are reducing. So think about how you can demonstrate that any efficiencies that you implement are having the effect that you wanted them to have.
Thank you. Sam?
So I think for manufacturers particularly, recognising that emissions reduction is going to become a market-winning opportunity, not just a responsibility. So start by understanding what your emissions footprint looks like, scope 1, 2, 3, and come for help from organisations like the Carbon Trust, the Catapults, to understand how you can do that if you need. And then start thinking about the strategy to reduce that emissions footprint, and then start with resource efficiency. So resource efficiency alone won't get you to net zero, but it's going to get you along the wins and start to see you probably returns on investment and financial savings as well in the short term. So a strategy that will take you there across all three emissions types, scopes, but start with resource efficiency. That's where the savings are. And it needs to be industry-led. Industry will deliver the changes. I agree with Mark's point that we can't look to government to step in and fix everything, but government can play a role with Catapults and others to help make it easier and lower risk.
Great, thank you. And very quickly, a few seconds left. Wouter, if you've got any final remarks, and then closing with Mark, and then we will go into a coffee break.
Yeah, I would say instead of follow the money, I would say follow the carbon. Pretty much what Sam said. Know your scope 1, 2, and 3. Get help to understand that, because otherwise you'll end up with what Mark was saying earlier, wanting to get a nice shiny heat pump when you don't need one. Don't get distracted, and usually the 80-20 rule applies. So find out what is that 80% of your carbon that you can address with just 20% of the effort.
Thank you. That's very, very, very good. And Mark, final words from you.
Well, I'm going to find it hard to follow those 4 points. I think they're spot on, so I'll endorse them. I think the thing that would help me and help government is engagement or our competitions. We're eager to help industry, but also to understand industry. So it really helps those programs that we're supporting really help us understand what's happening in industry. And I think the big attraction of the IEA program is you do get support from the Carbon Trust and Jacobs. So as Sam referenced, you do get the technical insight to make sure what you're doing is sensible. And I would urge companies, small and large, to start looking at their strategy to net zero, so they make sure they can make the most efficient investments and do it in the most financially attractive way.
Great, thank you. And really huge thanks to everybody who's participated in this discussion. I think it's been a really wide-ranging, very insightful panel. So really, thank you. And I hope everyone enjoyed it. So we are now going to go into a short coffee break. And just picking up on Mark's point, if you are interested in the BEIS IEA, then please do you'll check out the resources tab on the Glissa platform. You'll find the phase 1 and 2 summary, so you can see what the projects are that we have already supported. And then if you're interested in getting involved in phase 3, which we have currently live for applications at the moment, then there is lots of information on how to get involved. But thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the next session after the 15-minute coffee break.